Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
And so we come to kind of that sweet spot where our engineers feel if we are provided this amount of time, that would be the optimal way to do it, to have full coverage end to end. And then anything after that, you would probably still see value, but it would be diminishing very quickly. So we try and hit right there out of the gate. Obviously, there's budgetary considerations that come into play. We very much recognize that at the end of the day, security is not a technology challenge. It's an economic challenge.
Black hat, white hat, gray hat? What does it all mean? Well, in this context, the different colored hats refer to different approaches to testing the cybersecurity of your IT, or in our case, IoT infrastructure. In this episode of the IoT Show, I speak with Paul Jauregui about pen testing and other things you need to know about when working with an external security assessment firm.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is for business leaders and managers employing the Internet of Things for their business or the business of their customers. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair, and I interview the industry's leading authorities to find out how they use IoT to improve business and create value. If you like this show, subscribe to it on iTunes and go to IoTinc.com to check out my complimentary articles, videos, meetups, and webinars.
There's a motherload of exclusive videos, presentation decks, special reports, and PDF transcriptions of all my podcasts and videos in what I'm calling Bruce's Private Reserve. Everything else is freely available on the site, but to get to these goodies, you need to sign up using the long version of the registration form. To do that, just go to www.iot-inc.com and you'll see it on pretty much every page. With me today on the IoT Business Show is Paul Jauregui. Paul is a member of Praetorian's founding team, where he's responsible for all aspects of marketing, branding, and communications. His work has been featured in Fortune, Forbes, NBC News, Business Week, and TechCrunch. I met Paul at Internet of Things World, and after a thoughtful discussion on security, I thought I'd invite him on the show. Paul, welcome.
Hey, Bruce. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you've been around a little bit. So what's new? What have you been up to lately?
Well, based on our conversation over at IoT World, definitely gave you the impression that I've been, dove into the deep end of security. Been swimming in there for the last 5-6 years now. Recently, I just got finished with delivering a presentation over at the Design Automation Conference, which was actually hosted here in Austin, Texas this year, which was very convenient for me, just a few blocks down.
Design Automation Conference, okay.
Yeah, and so it is sponsored by the IEEE, and
Got it.
Big focus on embedded systems, and I was part of a session that was focused on IoT security specifically. Able to talk a little bit about some of the cool projects we're working on over here at Praetorian, and another member of the panel was actually the CTO from Cisco. She is focused on industrial Internet of Things security.
Sure.
Really great we actually met at the speakers breakfast in the morning that they required us to come out to at 7:30 a.m. and basically got lost in deep conversation for about 2 hours talking about the issues around IoT security. It was pretty fascinating to get her perspective.
Now, are you also focused on the industrial side, or where what's your guys' playground?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Before really getting into IoT security, as we call it, as a company, we we've had a long history of engaging enterprise and venture-backed startups, performing more traditional network infrastructure assessments, as well as working with development teams that may be putting out applications, software, basically, doing penetration testing and security assessments on that front. Now, we have worked in the past and, are continuing to do so, work with, say, ATM manufacturers, kind of from chip to code, whether it's connected medical devices, and even looking at industrial controls from the context of more looking at it from the IT side of the space, basically demonstrating if we can infiltrate, compromise a workstation on the IT side, pivot around the network, look for a way to jump over to the industrial control network segment, and whether that's in a manufacturing or oil refinery context, that's kind of has been our world in kind of getting exposed to IoT. We really started calling it and I can say marketing it and reaching out and having conversations, calling it IoT security. That started about 2 years ago for us.
So a while ago then.
It's a little while. I'd say this year, actually leading into the end of last year is when things really started picking up a lot more on the consumer product side. So we've been doing a lot of work with great companies, big brands who are essentially transitioning their organization and their standard product into the connected world, whether that be, connected products within, a smart home setting. So connected ovens or washer dryer, various items throughout the household. So more connected products at this point, ultimately leading to, laying in that infrastructure and foundation to really realize that smart home experience.
When we start, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your background is. I guess you've talked a little bit about your background in IoT.
Sure. So my background is actually in marketing. That's kind of what. What I bring to the table.
At least it's not sales.
No. Well, I do get to work with clients and help them through their problems. So I have a bit of my foot in there.
I'm kidding. I'm both marketing and sales myself.
Okay. But I actually started, back in college studying advertising. I was really interested in the creative side of it, whether that was putting together great, ads or, videos. I was really appealed to the sexy side of advertising.
Don Draper style.
I guess you could kind of go along that way, but a little
carousel.
More modern style of that. But, at the time I was not really connected, I was young, not really connected to the business side, the business impact of what advertising brought to the table. Again, just focused on the creative. And I had a professor who sat me down and said, Paul, you could really go study anything and bring so much back to the table. So whether that be study psychology and, understand how people think and how to relate to that, or research history, study history to see trends, maybe, to understand where we're going based on where we've come from. And so I took his advice and transferred out of the advertising department and moved into film. So I actually finished up my undergrad degree with a focus on radio, television, and film. I spent a little bit of time working in the film industry here in Austin, Texas, which doesn't pay well at all compared to, say, if you were located in Los Angeles. And so on the side, I was doing a lot of marketing work, kind of my own consulting work. And one of my roommates in college was actually Nathan Sportsman, who is the founder of our company here. He has a deep history in security, several patents, published author, has lectured at the NSA, worked at several of the major organizations. So he was in the process of pulling together a team of like-minded folks, kind of the top 5%, so to speak. And I was working with him on the sidelines, kind of a la carte. He was one of my clients, and it got to the point, I went back to school and got my MBA. So I kind of came full circle and got that business context and just dove right in. And for me, I really wanted to understand with my work with my clients, what that business impact was. And so I saw what Nathan was doing with Praetorian, just getting it started back in early 2008. Kind of got to the point where, I wanted to so I could provide more value from the inside and dive into the deep end of security. And I'm a kind of a Sunday morning political talk show junkie. So there was one, Meet the Press, maybe it was, and the director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, was talking about the number one risk to America, to the United States, is cybersecurity, and so that really resonated with me, and I've been kind of jumping full bore jumping right in ever since, and soaking it all in. And so now, coming full circle, talking about IoT, I've taken the reins as the IoT business lead here at Praetorian. So I'm working directly with clients, understanding their needs, and even managing projects through to completion. So really taking a lot of what I've learned with engaging in the IoT community and consuming great content such as, the stuff that you put out, frankly, which has been a great asset to me. Really trying to understand how we can relate to product teams who are putting out solutions to IoT solutions, as well as deployments within enterprise. And so that's kind of where I sit. Now, my big focus is IoT security and how we can engage our partners and our clients to figure it all out. It seems like everyone is just trying to figure it out, both on the implementation, deployment, as well as the service providers along the way. And we certainly have been making strides to help push that understanding forward.
All right. Well, let's zero in on these engagements a little bit. So, give us a scope. What does a security mandate usually look like for you guys? Sure.
So the way I'd answer that is putting it in the context of maybe the driving motivations of our clients, right? That's really what it maps back to. And so conversations typically start with a firm like us. And again, we're that external security expertise that organizations will tap.
What do they call you? What is it? What's your class of firm?
So we are an information security assessment and advisory firm.
Okay.
Really, at the heart of it, the cornerstone of our business is penetration testing, being able to identify risk and prioritize it and provide a pathway to remediation. So that flows a little bit into risk management and just assisting organizations through that. But back to the motivations, typically, say if it's an organization who's developing IoT solutions for enterprise, maybe it's a retail setting that they're deploying their solution into, or manufacturing, kind of a logistical transit and tracking assets. Typically, motivations of platforms and solutions, kind of connected products, they'll reach out to us because the clients that they're selling into, or the prospects, typically have security requirements and start asking security questions as they start engaging the sales process, right? And so the folks who reach out to us oftentimes are trying to enable their own sales into enterprise to be able to satisfy a lot of the requirements of large companies and other folks who are maybe introducing their IoT solutions into their environment.
So these security requirements that you're talking about, it's interesting because, well, are they general IT security, networking security, and then they're kind of trying to retrofit them into IoT, or have they actually taken the time to create IoT security requirements?
Well, so it's a mixture, right? The way we look at IoT from our side, we take a holistic approach. So everything we say from chip to code, and so that's our perspective and the way we look at it. Obviously, from the enterprise side of things, if you're selling into the IT side of the house, and maybe it's a solution that's being deployed, and maybe it's a smart, facilitating some sort of smart building. Maybe it's a smart lighting system throughout their buildings. Just taking that, for example, At the end of the day, they are tying that into their, IT infrastructure, right? It's connected to their network, whether it's, segmented logically or not. It's a new asset class that they have to manage and understand. So that's one thing. So the technology itself, they need assurances that the product is secure, right? That their data is safe, that there's no way that folks from the outside can use it as a beachhead into the network to either compromise other systems or launch attacks or compromise those assets alone. I think the technology side of it, from a vulnerability identification, is one part of it. The other part is really the vendor's policies themselves, right? I think a really good example of that, especially if they're going to be managing the data. If they have their own cloud solution and maybe they're providing analytic services or some sort of management interface on top of that, the actual hardware and kind of network layer stuff, the organization needs assurances that those have been built in a secure manner.
Which organization are you referring to?
So let's just say it's a Fortune 500 company who's talking with a provider of a platform to enable building automation. So, knowing where their employees are to enable features and services, to, understand proximity and, know who's in what part of the building to be able to provide value in some way, whether that's smart lighting or whatever it may be throughout the building. So making sure that the actual technology itself is built in a secure way and managed in a secure way. The other part of it is the policies of the company that would be selling into. I think that's a big thing. One of the lessons learned is if we take a step back and look at the big target breach. Again, I'm not bringing this up as in an effort to, spread more
fearmonger.
Exactly. Yeah. But more in an effort to illustrate a point with a public example that everyone is aware of for the most part. So the way that the folks got in was through a third-party vendor that was basically responsible for managing Target's HVAC system remotely. So this third-party vendor had legitimate access to the network and was able to monitor and control these systems remotely. So if you want to kind of equate that to IoT, and there's some OT systems involved there, and third-party management providing value and services. If we want to call that an IT solution or IoT solution, we can. I think it's fair to maybe have it in that context. And so under that, the way that the bad guys got in was they compromised that third-party vendor and leveraged that level of access to infiltrate Target's data center and ultimately exfiltrate, customer data, credit card information, and everyone's I think aware of the blowback from that. And so that's a really great example, and I think it's a big wake-up call. There was implications at the top when it came to Target. Some C-level folks got hit pretty hard, and so it's a wake-up call. It's important that these organizations are vetting the partners they bring in. I think in a connected world, as everything starts becoming connected, it's very important, and that kind of maps to a shared responsibility model and being able to vet. Do the due diligence up front to understand the risk associated with those partnerships.
What do you mean a shared responsibility model?
Well, it's something I've been thinking about. There's nothing really, from what I know, tied down, or it's not a framework I'm looking to walk through here. But one of the best ways for me to kind of explain it is kind of in a story that I heard from. I was having a conversation with the CISO of GE Lighting. As you know, this is in the public. They're working with smart cities and trying to understand how to deploy smart lighting solutions in, say, across a smart city context and other services and value that would come around that. And so this is a guy, and he was telling me that people always come up to him and ask him, what's that one thing that keeps you up at night, right? He's charged with security, and that's his mission. And his response was always been, this is what he told me. His response was always, well, nothing. Heck, nothing. This is a guy who was former military. He was a police officer, and so he's really seen the worst of the worst, right? So he, relative to what he's experienced, he's in a good position to address those risks, and nothing really keeps him up at night. But he mentioned IoT. Thinking about IoT is really something that's starting to get his attention, and it might soon be that one thing that keeps him up at night. Because in a connected world, say in a smart city context, if there's an attack at a parking meter, right? If there's a breach that traverses the network, going up through kind of a parking infrastructure, and crosses networks and traverses across the networks to affect back-end systems and other connected systems that how do you know what assets you're responsible for? How do you know what you need to respond to? What's the responsibility of the city and the folks who are deploying these? How would a company like GE Lighting contractually navigate that responsibility? It's really interesting. And then even down to the value chain of the actual devices themselves that are deployed, right? From the embedded systems at the hardware level, the chips, the chip manufacturers, up to, the developers doing the software, managing the back-end cloud services and infrastructure. I mean, there's just so many connected pieces in a connected world that really need to figure out a way to delineate and kind of well-defined, either contractually or just have a well-understood understanding of who is responsible for what. And I think when industry moved to adopt cloud technologies, and enterprise took their time, they held on to their data, and for a long time wouldn't want to put it in the cloud. I think now we're in a time where it's totally changed. The clients we deal with are the top of the top, and they're all in either Amazon or Azure or whatever it may be, Google Compute. And, that there's a shared responsibility model that is mapped out that, is well-defined within, kind of a infrastructure as a service model, or a platform as a service model, or a software as a service model. There's a well-defined understanding of what the customer is responsible for and what the platform provider is responsible for. So I think IoT definitely needs some sort of framework and understanding to get security to a good state as more and more stuff comes online.
Yeah, there's certainly a few more moving parts compared to a cloud type application, or a deployment, and cloud is one of them. But you get me thinking is that I would think that it's going to be, at least initially, and maybe it'll be worked down from there, but I would think it'd be the system integrator that would share, or that would have the first round of responsibility. Does that make sense?
I think you're right, at least from ongoing support and management.
I know I would put that in my contract, that's for
exactly.
Sure.
And I think it's going to map back to these contractual agreements, and the integrators and the folks who are managing these deployments and overseeing it over time and providing support have to be that front line. Yeah. And then trickle down from there, those guys need to have a clear understanding of what sort of technologies they're working with, and assurances that those producers, whether it's at the chip level or, if they're having third-party firms develop software or adopting, third-party, IoT enablement platforms to enable them to integrate these services, they have to vet those thoroughly too. So it's definitely a trickle down, and there's a choke point right there at the integrators. I do agree with you, these devices are going to be put out in the field to operate for 10, 15 plus years. So there needs to be some sort of ongoing stewardship of those in terms of security over time, to patch them, stay on top of things.
Yeah, and I think that'll evolve. But let's go back to the mandate question. I want to get a little bit more specific. So, your mandates, I mean, are they penetration testing mandates, or first of all, what do they look like? What is it, or is there a typical? Or maybe you can just talk about your typical customer. But what do these mandates look like when they engage you guys?
Yeah, so definitely. So back to the motivations. Definitely, our core business is on the penetration testing side, and so organizations will come to us with those specific needs, whether they call it an end-to-end IoT pen test or a security assessment or whatever language they use. It kind of maps back to an assessment of risk within the product or system. And so I gave you a little insight into maybe in a B2B context. The mandate typically comes from the organization they may be selling into, right? So they have some gating functions that are mapped to security that they have to check the box through and provide assurances. One of those is penetration testing often. And so they would engage us to conduct the penetration test on, say, a more consumer-facing IoT solution, right? I mentioned smart ovens, I believe in one of our conversations, smart dishwashers, so on and so on, anything in the connected home. A lot of organizations, and these are big enterprises, big brands that maybe have a 100-year history of selling these appliances and maybe it's an HVAC system within the home. As those start to kind of migrate into the connected world, and you're seeing Wi-Fi communication modules put in there. They're starting to connect to the home local area network and then connecting back to back-end systems to provide more value and services. Those companies have a huge, they are motivated by the more reputational risk that's associated with deploying their devices. They have typically huge brand, and as they move into this connected world, it's new. They need to be provided assurances that they are entering into that new world safely, and their brand will be well protected as they make steps forward. And so,
will you guys ever assure that?
Well, so the assurances we provide. So I guess that would kind of take a few steps into the process here of, say, a penetration test. And the goal of the penetration test is really to demonstrate real-world risk, to identify vulnerabilities, prioritize those risks, and then deliver recommendations on how they can, map out their remediation plan following. There could be two approaches. Say if we take one of those consumer product facing companies, if their questions they're looking to answer were more wrapped around, hey, we just want to stay out of the headlines. That's our motivation. That's our mandate. We cannot have a breach or some incident that
like Target.
Like Target. And there's other companies, more on the IoT side that are putting out products that have found their way into the news for negative, reasons. And so that's basically an internal mandate that we need to do due diligence to have a firm understanding of the risks that map back to our business from a reputational standpoint. And so penetration testing can be conducted in a black box setting or a more white box approach, right? And so...
And which do you and can you explain the two of them, and then which one do you normally do?
Yeah, and so black box is essentially a zero knowledge based demonstration of risk, right? So our engineers, as they enter into it, are not provided anything beyond just typical access that a normal user would have, right? So they have the device. Maybe it's the understanding that they've purchased it and they have a user account. So what could some malicious actor do with that level of access, right? Could they, what would happen if they tear down the device, desolder the flash memory, dump the firmware and secrets bit by bit, reverse engineer the firmware, identify backdoors and logical flaws that would impact, a wide deployment of these devices out in the field. And so in a black box, really the motivation in that context is to understand, okay, we're either about to ship out our products, or maybe we have, a set of them out in the field and we're looking to scale up. I need assurances and understanding that, how much time is it going to take for someone to do some real damage to those out in the field? What level of sophistication would be required to execute that level of attack and have that, and what is the impact to our business potentially? And so in a black box setting, typically the way we would approach it is to, at least have some understanding of the architecture, what components go into it. We'd probably.
But wait a second, isn't that a white box then?
Well, so we would do that, with publicly available information, right?
Okay.
And so, the FCC, if it's, doing any sort of wireless communication, there would be FCC records. We could actually, without even tearing open the device, we could go pull up photos of the onboard electronics.
Interesting.
We could take a look at those, maybe try and identify.
That's all available. I did not know that.
Yep, it's all available. And this is part of the process. This is actually, what we're doing is demonstrating real world risk. And this is how it happens out in the environment. And so there's a discovery phase and a reconnaissance phase of any sort of penetration test. And that's the same if you're doing an internal network assessment or, a connected product assessment. So the FCC would have photos of that. What folks would be looking for is maybe identifying the chipsets that are embedded. They'd want to have an understanding of those, maybe go to that manufacturer, pull down the documentation, start to educate themselves on that, maybe identify debugging pens or pads that may be present. So and
that's identified too?
Well, you can infer.
Or you can deduce it maybe, right? Yeah.
Right. And so before you break open the device, this is part of the process. Obviously, you'd want to go in and verify manually and tap in and tie into either JTAG or UART to have some sort of connectivity and feedback from the actual embedded device itself. But yeah, that's all part of the process. And so it's about doing that reconnaissance to have an understanding of the size and scope of the product you're assessing, and then really time box it, right? Does the organization want to allow us to spend 3 weeks, 5 weeks, maybe with an engineer or two dedicated to seeing what can be accomplished within that clear time window? Those are the kind of things on the black box side. That answers those questions for them.
Yeah. Take us to the white box now.
So white box is, for us, our preferred method. I think it provides the most value.
More efficient, yeah.
It's extremely efficient. And so what that looks like from a logistics standpoint is full access, right? So we get access to the source code. We get access to architectural diagrams, very, very deep access. It's essentially, we are an extension of their internal team. We see everything, right? And so what we're able to do is, through the penetration test, it's code assisted. And so whether that's looking at the firmware or, back-end web services, looking through code and conducting our pen test in kind of a more dynamic way, as well as kind of static, verifying stuff at code level, it enables us to expedite various test cases, right? So if we're maybe looking into an authorization bypass flaw, and we suspect that something's there, we can go very quickly and look at code and say, okay, yes, that's there. It's present. We know how to give you a recommendation on how to address that, and we will tell you how to do that at code level. So it not only makes our job more efficient, but it provides remediation, expediency as well. And then that the other way in a black box approach, if it was a similar test case, we would have to essentially just keep hitting it and fuzz it, and then finally figure out, okay, that's how you break it. So that does take a lot longer. So white box definitely provides a lot more value. We operate best and deliver the most value when we're seen as an extension of the internal team that brings that deep security expertise.
Yeah, no, and that matches my experience as well. And sometimes what I recommend is both. And so, but I put a much smaller window where you do a black box for, say, 2 days. And I'm telling you, if people are motivated more than 2 days, okay, that says something else. Yep. And then white box it, again, within some scope. So let's talk about that scope. Can you give us some ideas, again, in terms of budgets? And that could be dollars, that could be time. What are we looking at to do? I guess for both, but it depends on how you do it. But yeah, what are we looking at? What are we looking at in terms of generally what companies are spending with you, time and dollars? If you can share that type of information.
Sure. So the way we typically, our typical IoT engagement, I mentioned earlier that we look at IoT security holistically. We like to call it from chip to code. And so if there was a product that was brought in, say for the smart home, there would be several components involved, right? We've got the embedded systems, the firmware, the wireless communication protocols, the various applications, whether they be web interfaces or mobile applications, oftentimes in kind of a residential setting, any third-party integrations, and then the back-end infrastructure and cloud services. And so that kind of looks at it from start to finish. And so what we do is when we enter into kind of that first discovery call with customers, we start obviously understanding their motivations, right? We talked about some of those. And so based on those motivations, we would tailor a plan and an approach that would satisfy what they're looking to do. And so let's take, for example, kind of at the bigger initiative, say it was an end-to-end IoT assessment. So that would involve all the components, maybe looking at them individually and then also in concert, so you can understand the interplay between them and various trust relationships throughout.
Yep. Important.
Very important. Yep. And so what we would do is typically take a look at the architecture, have an understanding of those various components and what would be in scope. And then we would prioritize those and lay out a schedule around those. And so typically what we're seeing, say if we're conducting both a black box and a white box, and we do that within maybe kind of a phased approach, starting with the black box. Maybe, depending on the size and complexity of the product and environment we're looking at, on the low ends, like you said, we could take maybe a week or two. On maybe a more complex system, maybe we'd want to get up to 3 weeks for a black box portion of that assessment. And then slowly we would start phasing into white box as they start passing us information. So we would already come to the table of the white box phase with a certain level of understanding, and then be able to really maximize our efforts. So we might take another 2-3 weeks for the white box, depending on the number of components that we'd be looking at. So all in all, if you're looking at an end-to-end IoT assessment, in terms of time, anywhere between 2 to 5 weeks. If there's multiple products and it's a complex environment, and maybe you're servicing multiple regions around the world with various backends, right? So maybe North America, South America, Latin America, Europe and Asia. There could be a lot at play, and if everything's in scope, naturally it would take more time and attention.
Okay, and so roughly 2 to 5 weeks, and then I'm guessing there has to be some correlation with the size of the organization as well, because that's going to be related to the risk. So, for example, I'm going to ask you in a minute, what this is all going to cost. But for example, with a startup, they have a budget, and they can, they're probably going to be on the closer to the 2 week side, only because the risk associated with it is going to be a lot less than the risk associated with a Fortune 500 company or Fortune 50 company. So I guess that's my first question. I would imagine the answer is yes, but are you seeing it also correlated, this 2 to 5 weeks, on the barometer of company size? Sure,
absolutely. And how we address that, initially our preliminary proposal and how we position our approach is based on time and level of effort, right? And so we come to kind of that sweet spot where our engineers feel if we are provided this amount of time, that would be the optimal way to do it, to have full coverage end to end. And then anything after that, you would probably still see value, but it would be diminishing very quickly.
Sure.
So we try and hit right there out of the gate. Obviously, there's budgetary considerations that come into play. We very much recognize that security is not, at the end of the day, security is not a technology challenge. It's an economic challenge. We very much recognize that security is not, at the end of the day, security is not a technology challenge. It's an economic challenge.
So this well said.
Yeah, and so this definitely speaks to that. And so if an organization maybe is earlier on in their life cycle and they have other priorities for their business, but security is still very important, what we do is then prioritize and maybe map back to their budget. So that could be rolling back scope a little bit, and maybe there's some components that might not be as high risk that we would say, you know what, these areas might take a lot of time to look at, but if we were to prioritize it based on the time window that you would allow us to conduct our work, we really should focus in on these areas and really be guided by our perceived level of risk within the environment or product.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's a couple points that come up here. Number one, unfortunately, people don't want to spend money on security. And the reason they don't want to spend money on security, because right now, notwithstanding what you brought up earlier in terms of certain requirements, security requirements, but notwithstanding those issues, people generally are really wanting to have the new bells and whistles before they have the security. So you've got that challenge, and then the second challenge one is looking at it from the wrong way. And you've brought this up a few times. I brought it up, and looking at it, the business counterpart to security is risk management. And so understanding what is the total risk, and that's what I was saying earlier. A startup, they go bankrupt. It's going to be, let's say there's a $10 million risk because that's how much money they put into the company. So obviously you're not necessarily, that's pretty much the top end. So you're not going to spend, that's your maximum risk. So you're going to look and see, okay, what do I need to do to mitigate that? A larger company, the risk is going to be higher. And then you need to go through, and this is the risk assessment process that you've alluded to, you need to go through each part of the architecture, whether that is kind of feeling your way, like feeling for the elephant in the black box or in the white box. But these are the two aspects. One, product managers are wanting to get features out and spend money on features, and number two, sometimes this is done the wrong way, and it's not being driven by business. But it seems like you guys are looking at it from a risk point of view, not necessarily from a security point of view, and there is a difference, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We do at the end of the day consider ourselves a team of engineers, but we bring that business acumen to the table, right? So in terms of risk, you've said it on your show before, it's very well understood in the security community, but essentially risk gets mapped to, the cost of a potential breach, right? Yep. Multiplied by the likelihood that event would occur. Now, what's interesting about that, and you're right, a security, or excuse me, an IoT startup, they put $10 million into it and they're pushing forward with it. And they, deployed their product out in the field, and there was an irreversible change that they could not address. And there was complete brand and reputation damage, going out of business situation. Not to say that there is, but this is a hypothetical. $10 million, that was their loss, right? At the end of the day, all security spend should be to mitigate a loss to the business.
Right.
And
absolutely.
If we go back to the Target example, again, just a well-known one, the Target CIO was very, I believe he was quoted saying that, he's not willing to spend $10 million in security to avoid a $1 million loss, right?
And makes sense.
So that statement is completely true, and that's the right approach. The only problem with that was that he got his risk formula wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't correctly understand the true cost of that level of breach.
And the reputational cost?
Right. And so, it's an interesting point. There's a very simple formula: risk equals cost of breach times likelihood. But
it's an art.
How you arrive at those variables is very complex and very much difficult to do sometimes.
Yeah, and I would even go, having been in these type of meetings, I would even go beyond that and say, yes, it's complex, but at the end of the day, it's an art. And it really comes down to a lot of times experience and gut level decisions and, just putting your finger up in the air. And so people can't get grinded down in the analysis paralysis on this process. But yeah, you bring up a great point. You bring up that's an excellent example with Target in terms of, maybe the hard loss was $1 million, but the reputational loss could have been, I don't know, 100 million, something like that. So, okay, so we have that. I think we're painting this picture pretty clearly. What's the cost per week generally for an organization like yours? So what are our listeners having to think about for budgeting? Because, you want them to come to you with the right budget, right?
Yeah. So, we operate kind of a very simple formula. I'm happy to share that with your audience. So when we put out statements of work and proposal in the scope of work, everything is documented and mapped back to hours and
okay.
It's fixed bid essentially. And so, that maps back to, for us, it's a rate of $250 an hour. So for a security engineer to be performing, the activities, that he or she may be conducting, for any given week, it would be, 40 hours, let's say, at $250 an hour, so about $10,000 a week. Okay. So you can map that up to some of the weeks, that we talked about there, and kind of arrive at where we're sitting for a typical engagement.
No, and listen, I'm actually not connected to any security company. I do use them, but that's about right. And we're talking 10K a week, and just looking at your numbers, 20 to 50K. Listen, that is so worth it. It is so worth it, with the caveat of I'm assuming though that you've got more to lose than the 20K or the 50K, which I would assume that would be right. So in my view and my recommendation, it's money well spent, specifically because going externally, because we just don't have that talent internally. I've not been to any organization, any of my clients, where we've got some smart guys, but they might be smart networking guys. They might be smart web interface guys. They might be smart cloud guys. They might be smart app guys. But then even what you brought in, the system issue, this interdependency between each of these security systems, it's just tough to find the right people. And so, if we're talking about 20 to 50K, this is so worth it. And I don't know. I don't know how many times I need to say it, but it's really good that you're explicit, Paul, and I really appreciate that, because it just gives our listeners an idea of budget. And again, it has to be spent wisely, and you want to prioritize that budget within whatever you can. But for, let's say even 20K, I think most startups, and specifically the officers of those startups, because they have risk associated with themselves being an officer of the company, I see that as a no-brainer. But it's so surprising, it's so surprising where, I've talked to people and they've been dealing with companies. They say, is there a way that we can actually just not have any security at all? Completely eliminate it. And it's just mind-boggling to me. But anyway, enough of the rah-rah on this one. I think you brought up a few good points. Now, I want to think about in terms of getting the most out of it. So for our listeners who are now going to engage with a security assessment firm, pen testing generally being a big part of it, how should they prepare so that they're most efficient when working with you? I think that's good for you, and it's certainly good for them to not burn through your hours. But what should they be doing? What should they be doing in advance of selecting a firm?
Sure. And I'll roll into that answer, but I wanted to throw out a quick point to the last topic we were talking about. And
Yep.
that is, the real problem at the end of the day is not any individual set of vulnerabilities, right? It's rather a lack of security consciousness in the field, right? So product managers, engineers, developers, and even testers rarely come to the table with that deep security knowledge or skill set, just like you mentioned. It's very, that technical expertise that's dedicated to various core disciplines within security, and there's quite a few. They rarely come to the table with that expertise, and even if they do, things evolve so rapidly that it's very difficult for people to keep pace. And so that is really where we provide the value. It's being that extension of your internal teams that provides that expertise when needed.
Up-to-date expertise.
Yeah, when needed. And we have the visibility of seeing it across a wide set of various industries and other folks who are dealing with similar challenges. And so, for those reasons, I just wanted to throw those out as well. Appreciate you talking about the advantages of bringing in that outside expertise. And
it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. And so leading into what organizations could do once they understand that there's value and it's something that needs to be done, activities that need to be conducted, they need to help. Essentially, they need to understand what the immediate questions they're trying to answer are, or what the immediate hurdle there's from a business side.
Like their motivations you were talking about.
Exactly. Right? So have a firm understanding of your motivations and what you're looking to accomplish. It's very, you're not going to find as much success if you come in without that firm understanding. And if you don't have that firm understanding, seek to find that before you engage a firm like us, or engage us and we can walk through that conversation together. But is this to enable your sales into enterprise? Is it to help shorten your sales cycle and overcome a lot of those requirements that your customers are asking of you? Okay. With that said, let's seek to address that first. Let's address the immediate issues that are in front of you, and then work out to build out a more mature approach, the way that the product teams and organization is approaching security over time. And so understanding what you're looking to accomplish out of the gate is very important. I'd say the next thing that is important is to understand you need to plan for remediation. If you're unable to allocate resources or your development cycles to addressing these issues, there's no value in conducting it, right? You're understanding the risk, you're identifying it, we're helping you to prioritize that risk. But if you're not in a position to address it, wait until you are. So that would be
good advice.
That would be another recommendation. So with that said, if that involves third-party partners, oftentimes in kind of an IoT setting, you're having to work with third parties, whether it's developing the mobile app component, or maybe it's an IoT enablement platform that's enabling you to get your proof of concept and test the market early before you jump up and scale. Rope them in too. Bring them in.
Absolutely.
Because their technology and their platform and their software and their development teams need to have a voice at the table, especially in this white box context. They need to be able to provide code. And oftentimes, if an organization has enough leverage because of their size and over an IoT enablement platform, say it's a Fortune 500 consumer-facing product company, and they're using an IoT enablement platform in their communication modules and their back-end cloud infrastructure, and go down the line. Oftentimes, that big company is going to have some leverage because that's the big logo that they're shining on the front of their website, and that's their probably makes up a majority of their business. Right. And so. That leverage, use that leverage, make sure you look in your partners, bring them to the table, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones that are going to be needing to be involved in remediation as well.
No, that's great advice, Paul. And I guess the only thing I'd add, and maybe you kind of were alluding to that, or maybe you explicitly said it, but also know what you have. And so from a security point of view, be prepared. So the tech team has to be prepared with an architecture. They have to be prepared with whatever security work they've done. You want to prep that, right? I mean, they're going to need that information. I think it's a great idea in terms of the budget, making sure that you can then execute on it. There's no sense, because things are going to change also, not only in the world, but it's also going to change internally. They're going to change their code. The only thing is, that I'm concerned about, and it makes a lot of sense to use the application enablement platforms, and I like where you're going with that. Yeah, I think it's a topic for another show to see how far they'll open up the kimono. But just the issue of security by design is something that needs to be done from the very beginning. And so it's, when you engage, if you engage too late, there could be issues too. And so this is a bit of a balancing act. And so I would also recommend, and maybe you've got a different perspective on this, but if you don't have that really solid IoT experience, you might want to get these guys, you might want to get them for a week or maybe even a couple days to make sure that your initial architecture is making sense from a security by design architecture point of view. Do you have anything to add to that, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first, companies need to be implementing security by design, and that's what you're getting at. They should build it into their. It's
hard to retrofit it.
Yes, well, it's much more expensive, and yes, it is. It takes a lot more resources to do so. They really need to be baking it into the product and solutions from the outset rather than an afterthought. I think for the most part, development or connected product teams are good about going through the motions in terms of establishing a set of security requirements throughout the research and development process. I think they are. The only disconnect there is you can't have a line item and said, okay, I need encryption communication between my mobile device and my backend cloud system, right? At the end of the day, yes, that is a security requirement, but how are you going to implement that? And how, after the product is built, we would come in to verify that implementation matches those business requirements for security. And so you're right, bringing outside security expertise in early in the design phase to either conduct threat modeling exercises, to understand kind of various attack vectors that maybe your teams are not thinking about, and how you
and ensure you're following best practices. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and so why you would do that? It's to save money over the course of the lifetime, right? Because it's right. As you mentioned, if we come in for a couple of days or maybe a week, conduct more of looking at the architectural plans, what sort of technologies you're looking to implement, how are you doing encryption, why are you doing this that way, and starting to talk about risk and addressing risk early. It's very easy to move around a diagram on a page and change some words rather than re-implement something. And so
recoding it
exactly.
A year later or 6 months later.
Right.
Yeah. Excellent advice, Paul. Where can people find out more about you and your organization?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find Praetorian is just searching Google for IoT security testing. We usually come up at the top there. You can visit Praetorian.com. I'm sure you'll have.
I'll put that in the show notes.
The show notes, yeah. It's.
I don't know how to spell it, but I think I could get there. Yeah.
Yep. And we're also, LinkedIn, Twitter. Twitter is @Praetorian Labs. Okay. I can also be found on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. One thing that I've done in the past, I'm definitely a big fan of your show and have listened to all the content through the podcast, is I've actually gone out and reached out and just, to your guest and said, hey, I really enjoyed your perspective there. I heard you on Bruce's podcast, and, it's great to start up that dialogue. And it's all about just continuing the conversation, and, definitely recommend if anyone's interested to reach out and just talk about IoT. I'm definitely one to nerd out on it, so I always enjoy it.
No, that's a great recommendation in terms of connections, and I've heard that from different listeners as well, where they've reached out and you just said it. You're more than welcome to have these discussions, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights, and we'll be talking soon.
All right, Bruce. Thanks so much. I've enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, that was episode 56. Another goodie, all made up of 2s and 3s again. To get analysis of this episode, to get to the links, and to see the transcripts, just go to the show analysis notes. They can all be found at iotinc.com/podcasts. Now remember, there's a hyphen between the IoT and the Inc. If you've been listening to this show for a while and you're finding it useful, I'd really appreciate a review. To do that, you just got to sign up with your iTunes app, and it takes seconds, or maybe even a minute if you can actually write a review. I read them all, and I appreciate it if you could spread the word. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your path to IoT business be a safe one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.